Hello and welcome. My name is Enrico Manalo. I am the Chief of Learner Success at All Aces Inc., which is based in Boston. We are here today with our brand new format, which is All Aces on Air. This is the first episode, so welcome once again. I'm here with a former professor of mine, Jeff Pugh of UMass Boston, who is in the McCormick Graduate School and teaches in the Conflict Resolution Department. Today, we're going to be talking about something that Jeff has developed through his research, which he calls the Invisibility Bargain. Uh, Jeff, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience a little bit?
Sure. Thanks, Rico, for having me on. It's a pleasure. I've enjoyed seeing the programming that All Aces is putting out that really takes a deep dive into some of the contentious and complex issues around race and identity. And so I'm really pleased to be a part of it. As Rico mentioned, my name is Jeff Pugh. I'm a professor at UMass Boston, and I consider myself a scholar practitioner. So in addition to teaching classes and doing research, especially on peace building and migration in the global South, and particularly in Ecuador and Latin America, I also have a practitioner hat. I founded a nonprofit organization called the Center for Mediation, Peace, and Resolution of Conflict, or CEMPROC. Actually, shortly after I graduated from undergrad at the University of Georgia, I went and lived in Ecuador for a year and founded this NGO that's still going. And so I imagine we'll talk some about that today. But I see this dual identity as really a central part of who I am, and it informs the kind of work that I do. All of the research that I do is usually motivated by something I see out in the real world, a problem that I want to learn more about, take a deeper dive, and study systematically.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jeff. And full disclosure to our audience, when I was in grad school, I was lucky enough to do the conflict Across Borders program that Jeff conducts out of Flaxo, Ecuador, with his foundation, CEMPROC. And it's a really fantastic program where Jeff puts students in touch with a lot of people who are doing the work on these border issues. And he's able to add a lot of context that we would not be able to get otherwise. And sadly, it's not running this year, but if you are interested in that, we can certainly post a link in the event that you'd like to maybe take a trip to Ecuador next year.
Absolutely. This is an example of the way I approach learning in general, that it's only useful if you're able to see an application for it. And the research I've done on how host populations and migrants navigate their differences and their conflicts to achieve peaceful coexistence is also something that we bring students to have a direct role. Our students were conducting research, they were engaging in dialogue with refugees, and several of the participants in the program then stayed on and helped to produce some of the research that has been part of this agenda. And with high level kinds of interaction with policymakers, ambassadors, foreign ministers, UN type folks. And so at UMass Boston, that's a lot of our approach, is taking learning into a practical space.
Absolutely. And we will return to that topic shortly in our program. But to begin with, we'd like to ask you, Jeff, in 30 seconds or less, how did you become you? So you answered this question a little bit. You mentioned that you went to Ecuador directly after undergrad, but how did undergrad Jeff Pugh go from being that person to the person that's sitting in this virtual room with us today?
Yeah, so Rico, I'm a complicated guy. This may take a while. No, really. I actually grew up in a small town in Georgia, and there weren't a whole lot of international type opportunities that I had until I got to the university. And at the University of Georgia, I was fortunate enough to be a foundation fellow, which gave me the opportunity to do a lot of travel And I actually, my first time in Ecuador was because my professor at UGA was Ecuadorian and had a lot of contacts and allowed me to go and spend a summer there doing research, which ultimately led to my first academic article. Then after I graduated later, I had this commitment to Latin America as a region. I think that having a context that you know well helps you to do better work, because if you try to be all things to everyone, you're going to produce superficial outcomes sometimes. So I knew Latin America, and then after that experience, South America and Ecuador were my areas of interest. And I also was coming to realize that violent conflict was a problem that I wanted to work on. It was something that was widespread, obviously harmful, and it didn't seem like we had very good answers to it, especially the kind of violence that happens at lower levels and is integrated into society, right? So one type of violence is two armies battling each other and going to war. But we also live in a violent society. Even if someone's not actively shooting, there are institutions, there are social practices, there's abusive hierarchies in our society that are baked in. And so I wanted to be able to go out into a context I knew, given my Spanish language interests and the experience in Ecuador, and also work on this problem that I had identified. And so those two pieces were part of what I think are core to who I now am, is the Latin American context and the interest in resolving conflict and addressing violence. So I lived in Ecuador for a year as I was starting SimProc, and that was important because it allowed me to develop relationships that are long-term, that I still have in place, to really learn from people rather than me parachuting in as a recent college graduate thinking that I knew everything, which I certainly didn't. It established early on a sort of reciprocal learning model that I've tried to follow even as I've accumulated more letters after my name and more gray hair in my beard. I've tried to keep that humility and reciprocal learning, that every time I go into a training situation, I think of it as a dialogue where I'm learning something and the people there are too, and we're trying to exchange, just as actually we're doing here now. So one of the early forums where I tried to do that was in partnership with the UN High Commission on Refugees, UNIFEM, and actually a therapy center. My NGO facilitated a series of dialogues in a town in the northern border region of Ecuador between Colombian and Ecuadorian women, and it was called Breaking Destructive Cycles. And during that week, in the municipal building of Ibarra, this beautiful ornate building, I was hearing these women talk about how even looking and sounding like each other and having a lot of the same beliefs, they saw each other as different as the other. And hearing them listen to each other for the first time sometimes and tell stories about how they had all these kind of stigmas in place, and that listening in a meaningful way to the other person, working towards a shared goal, was transforming those stigmas and helping them realize the humanity of the other person, was really transformational for me. It made me ask a lot of big questions, and I knew I wanted to know more, but at that point I didn't know, well, how do you get that? How do you get people to transform their prejudices and stigmas, especially in this migration space? So that's what I decided to use my doctoral studies to do, and really launched this sort of interest in migration and refugees around conflict resolution that has been driving my agenda. And now I'm about to publish my book. It should be on shelves in the beginning of next year, of 2021. And I would say it started in that room in Ibarra in 2005. So that was 15 years ago. This is a long time coming, but it also draws on hundreds, literally, of stories of people that I've met, that I've communed with during that time. And I hope that it will amplify their voices as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jeff. Well, because we know each other personally, I knew some of that. I didn't know all of that. And one thing that popped into my mind as I was hearing you speak, when we were in Ecuador together in, I believe, 2016, you, well, we had an exercise, just called the river exercise. I believe we were talking about trauma and personal narratives, and more on the personal narrative side, I think. But I remember that you made a comment that for you, the exercise represents continuity. Like you mentioned that your students, for you, appear to be part of the same stream that you are a part of. And so that story you just told really put all of that into context for me. And to be quite transparent with the audience watching, if I hadn't had those experiences with Jeff, who also was my advisor on a very, very late independent study, um, well, I wouldn't be working at All Aces or sitting here interviewing him today. So that whole kind of lineage and continuity and that whole relational aspect, I think, is something that's really crucial for me and is crucial for the work of advancing racial equity. So I'm really glad to see some of those things coming out in what you were saying. Um, so I'd like to find out a little bit more about your work. And so you talked about your relationship with Ecuador. And so, and you talked a little bit as well about identifying not only acts of physical violence, but what maybe we could refer to as structural or systemic violence that you are seeing in people that you met. And so I guess what I'm really curious about is how do you go from that recognition to developing this concept of the invisibility bargain? And it must have been hard to hit on because, as you mentioned, it's something that is invisible.
Yeah, so as I was learning more from refugees in Ecuador, and actually not only in Ecuador, Forsyth County, where I'm originally from, at one point was the fastest growing county in the country, and a lot of it was Hispanic and especially Mexican immigrants coming into the U.S. So I had that population as a point of comparison. And then I did field work in South Africa during my doctoral studies as well. Actually, the month after there was a wave of xenophobic violence towards migrants, especially from Southern African countries, Zimbabwe and other places nearby. And so in lots of contexts that I was learning about, I kept seeing this pattern over and over of multiple pathways. Some immigrants were welcomed, were portrayed as valuable contributors to the country. The story that was written about them was a positive one, and others were not. And then some of the narratives that people would use about immigrants that would lead to more conflict and towards more exclusionary kinds of responses would talk about their lack of gratitude. We opened up the door to them, and what do? They complain about it. Well, if you don't like it, go back where you came from, right? That message kept repeating over and over, and I was trying to figure out, why is that the answer? If I don't like something, the only option is to leave. What problem in our society has that as the only option, as opposed to actually solve the problem, right? So I was trying to figure out, what are the expectations, the assumptions that are underlying that. And then I also saw fear in some receiving countries. People were very fearful that something bad was going to happen as a result of a large immigrant population coming in. And it seemed to vary by what kind of population it was. So a larger one that came in more suddenly, and especially one that looked different, sounded different, believed different things than the host population, tended to get more backlash than one that was more homogenous. Not always, but that there seemed to be this social piece to it as well. And finally, there are so many narratives about the economic either burden or contribution of immigrants that seemed to be an important piece to the story as well. Are immigrants a burden? Are they job stealers? Are they part of who we are that are contributing to a diverse country? What's the economic piece here? And so over lots of years of stewing with these questions, I developed a fairly simple framework, actually. And maybe we can show this quick diagram that visualizes what I call the invisibility bargain. And essentially the idea is that most of the time in a receiving country, there is a willingness to give at least tacit acceptance to migrants. They're not chased out, they're not sort of actively persecuted if they fulfill certain expectations. And one of those is an economic or valued contribution. So the perception that they're contributing needed labor in the United States, for example. There are states that rely heavily on migrant labor and would go out of business without it. Are they bringing important skills? So in Canada, they have a skills-based migration system in place, and that's seen as a contribution. It's not only money, though. So there are some scholars who have recognized the importance, for example, of military service. We know that a number of undocumented immigrants in the U.S. context have gone and put their lives on the line in military service, and they are seen as more deserving because they're seen as contributing. Actually, a follow-up research project I'm doing now takes the lessons of what we did in Ecuador and applies it in the United States. And one of the things that we learn is that there's a much more willingness to tolerate political action or presence of migrants who are veterans compared to those who aren't, even if they're undocumented. So let's put that image back up so we can look at the different pieces. We've got the valued contribution. We have social and political invisibility. So what this means is there is an unwritten expectation that migrants are supposed to contribute their labor or economic contribution or value contribution, but not make waves. They should be serving the interests of the host country, but don't really have a strong enough belongingness to be able to complain about it, to say, I think, to make demands or demand their rights or make political claims on the government. So there's an expectation of political passivity. And if an immigrant is engaged in political contestation, that can result in a real backlash. So think about a few, I think it was last year, a member of our Congress, Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, was talking about some policies that she thought were important that would address some wrongs and social injustices in the U.S. context. And our president and then a popular cable TV host, Tucker Carlson, both responded to that, not by addressing the substance of the policy proposals, but by saying she should go back home, by which they didn't mean the U.S., which is where her citizenship is, but that she should go back to Somalia, where she was originally born. The idea that that I think Carlson said, we, taking ownership over the U.S., we rescued her from this country, and all she can do is complain and sort of spit back in our face. And so there was this real logic of a demand for gratitude that was defanged of any kind of political context. And that was towards a congressperson whose job it is to actually make policy. So think about how that gets extended to any other migrant population. And the final part of the framework is social invisibility. That if there are visible differences among the migrant population that are seen as violating some norm in the host society, then their very presence, and especially their politically engaged presence, is often going to lead to backlash. So think about the ban on hijab, on the Muslim headscarf ban in France, that the public presence of someone whose clothing and body shows that they have a religious belief that's different than the dominant one of the host society can spark a backlash. And so this framework says you're welcome to be here as long as you remember your place. And if you don't remember your place, which is at the very bottom of a social hierarchy, and are grateful for whatever we give you, then that welcome can suddenly turn around. So it results in a very precarious situation, a situation of vulnerability that allows physical presence, but not really a political participation, and you can't have access to your full identity. You have to choose. Do you want to be whole in your identity, or do you want to be safe in your presence here?
Right.
Now,
So if we were to collect all that together once again, it sounds like what you're saying could be boiled down to, if immigrants are to be seen, then they are not expected to be heard. And if they are heard, then they better be agreeing with the us that are the in group, if you will, with the full knowledge that they are most definitely in the out group, correct?
that's the invisibility bargain. And I use the word bargain, but I should be clear. This is an agreement in the way that a Faustian bargain is one. It's an offer you can't refuse. So although there is choice in the sense that maybe you could leave, that choice isn't very meaningful if you're a forced migrant, where leaving equals a death sentence. And we know structural violence and poverty, survival things mean that sometimes that choice isn't very meaningful. And so it's really imposed on people. And although there's no formal place it's written as a law, both parties are very aware of these dynamics. And you know that because of how strongly they're policed when they're violated, like these reactions that we saw to Representative Omar. So, yeah.
I mean, if I can just jump in here, one thing I know, unfortunately, from my own experience, it doesn't matter how long I'm alive in this country or how much work I do on advancing racial equity, when, not if, like when somebody tells me to go back home, it still hurts. You know, I'm 35 years old, still cuts.
And you raise an important point there, that although my current work focuses specifically on immigrants, so people who were not born here, who were born elsewhere and come here, some of the same logic we see popping up again with other kind of marginalized populations in the US context as well as elsewhere. So the kind of backlash that you saw to NFL pro athletes taking a knee in protest of violent police action, or actually the comments I mentioned earlier that Trump and Carlson made about Omar weren't just about her. They said, go back home to four of the sort of squad, these Congress people who were all women of color, and three of whom were born in the US. And yet go back home was this sort of easy phrase that people have access to say, you are other. You had Marie Breen Smith on a little while ago, and she has this concept of the suspect community, where people are put into a box just because of the body they are in, that you always have a contingent belonging, and you have to constantly prove yourself. And part of proving yourself, according to this framework, is shut your mouth and contribute your labor and play down your differences. So it really leads to vulnerability.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned that. At All Aces, one of the things that we talk about a lot as a team is recognizing our own internalized whiteness. And that's been very uncomfortable for a lot of us to have to pick through. it's uncomfortable for me. I don't mind sharing. Many people watching might be aware that, of course, there are a lot of issues of racism that are experienced primarily by Black Americans or Black people in general. And there's also probably the perception or the understanding that many Asian Americans, they are perceived as being closer to being white and so are therefore more accepted. Well, that might be how it is on the ground, but I can say as somebody who is still in that position, understanding the things that I have internalized that also hurt me, things that have helped me to advance in a white dominated world, that's very uncomfortable work to have to engage in, but I think very necessary. Something else I really wanted to ask you about, because we are talking about the invisibility bargain somewhat in the context of the US. If you'll recall, I had a classmate who started in my cohort at UMass Boston in the conflict resolution program, named Layla Da. She was from Cameroon. And if you recall, her capstone project was actually also on perception. And the seed of her project, as I remember it, and Layla, please feel free to yell at me later if I get this wrong. But Layla is from Cameroon, so very dark skin. But she noticed that once people heard her speak, and she has a French accent, their body language would change. And what she identified was that people first identified her as a Black American person, possibly African American. When they heard her speak, instantly they knew that she was not African American, and so they treated her completely different, which is heartbreaking, is mind-blowing. It's also something that I've experienced and seen myself. So I'm wondering about how that plays into your work, either in this context or elsewhere.
Yeah, so thank you, Enrico. That's an important point to bring out. And it's also one that I grappled with for a while, because we know that race isn't just a color pigment on a palette, right? Race is socially constructed, and the meaning that we give it is different in different contexts. So one of your cohort members as well did a master's thesis on Somalian refugees in Boston, Emily, and some of the people she talked to said the first time I realized I was Black when I came to the United States. Right back home, that didn't mean anything to me. We had clan, we had different tribal identities, but the color of my skin didn't make a difference because everyone was the same color essentially. But once I came to the US, that marker of difference was activated to completely shape the way people interacted with me. And so instead of interacting with me as a member of this particular clan, they saw me and said, "Oh, Black." And they had a sort of repertoire of prejudices or of behaviors or expectations around that. As you mentioned, there are sort of intersecting identities here. And so having an accent sets you apart as foreigner, which is layered on top of the kinds of expectations for a racial group. Just a quick plug, Christina Greer has a wonderful book called Black Ethnics, and actually Layla drew on it in her thesis, that explicitly compares African-American experiences, immigrants from Africa, and Afro-Caribbean immigrants, all in the context of the US, and finds that of those three, the ones that tend to have the hardest time and actually are most victimized are African Americans, the ones who were born here in the first place. So it's not a simplistic story that having an accent is the only marker that's going to activate a backlash. Sometimes structures of privilege and narratives in society put certain immigrants in a category above someone who is born here. So I think that's why the social invisibility part is actually one of the trickiest parts of this. It's just not the case that the more different you are, or the more different you look, the worse your experience is going to be. It's not that simplistic. It's more about how that difference is seen as violating some norm of the host society and the meaning that the host population puts on it. How is it stigmatized? Certainly in Ecuador, Colombians are about as similar looking as you can get to Ecuadorians. But there is a higher proportion of Afro-Colombians than there are of Afro-Ecuadorians. And so this anti-Blackness that you were mentioning before is layered on top of the xenophobia that happens in Ecuador. And when I've talked to folks, it is complex. Does an Afro-Colombian immigrant in Ecuador find more solidarity with Afro-Ecuadorians or with other Colombians who aren't Afro-descendant? And that can vary from place to place, which is one of the reasons why for my book, I wanted to do comparative work. So I did surveys in 6 different provinces, including Esmeraldas, which has a very high proportion of Afro descendant populations. And what I found was Afro-Colombians coming into Ecuador often will specifically go to Esmeraldas because they can blend in better. Their social markers of difference are not as obvious and aren't seen as violating host society norms as much as they would be in Quito, for example, where they stick out and are targeted for racial kind of prejudice. So all of that does certainly feed in here.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to, again, the program in Ecuador. And as part of that, Jeff asked us to interview some people and to put together a project that would perhaps enact some real change on the ground. And so I interviewed a student who was at our host university, which is Flaxo. And this young man took me out for breakfast. He is a Colombian person. And he told me a very strange story where he didn't really think about his identity as a Colombian person until he went out with some friends from his school. They went to a bar and were quite happily chatting. An Ecuadorian woman came in, sat down on one side of him, and she put her purse next to her elbow. But as soon as she heard him speaking in Colombian accented Spanish, she simply moved her bag to the other side of her body. And he said that after he saw this happen, he kept seeing it happen to him over and over again, to the point where he didn't want to speak when it came time to try to rent an apartment. He had his Cuban friend, I believe, do most or all of the talking.
Yeah, so what a heartbreaking story, right? To think that you belong, to see no meaningful differences, and to see the backlash sort of imposed onto you out of the blue by strangers that you have nothing to do with. I've also heard those kinds of stories over and over in ways that are heartbreaking. The flip side of that actually is one of the areas that inspires me about researching this topic, and is that this is not deterministic, right? The Invisibility Bargain describes tendencies that happen a lot, but within that, there's a lot of variation. And one of the things that causes the variation and that mitigates the backlash, that makes it less harmful, less likely to be a sort of lashing out in prejudice, is meaningful interaction. Academics talk about contact theory and the idea that if you have meaningful equal status interaction with someone from a different group, and that interaction is targeted towards a shared aim, that it breaks down dehumanization. It helps you realize what they are all about, something about their identities, and it helps you realize you're the same, right? That relationship means you have something in common. Whereas if all you know about them is the what you see on TV, that they're a member of this category, and your political elites and the media say that category is threatening, and you got to be careful. That's when the lady puts her purse on the other side. Or as someone that I worked with in Ecuador, a university educated woman who worked for an international organization, had just done a training in Esmeraldas and went out in her full professional suit to a restaurant like you're describing, except there it wasn't as subtle. A man came up to her and asked her how much she charged per hour as soon as he heard her accent, and had no idea who she was and made those kinds of assumptions because of the stigma of Colombians. So one thing I discovered is that as you have meaningful personal relationships, those narratives become harder to sustain. You have a more sophisticated and nuanced view of the other. And this happens even within ourselves, right? I came in with somewhat starry-eyed idealist kinds of narratives that were also somewhat superficial about refugees and migrants. And the more I spent time with people and in personal interaction, the more I understood them just like everyone else, as people who are looking to exercise agency over their own lives, are trying to do what's best for themselves and their families, and have a say in how they're treated. And part of my research team, I worked with the director of SIMPROC in Ecuador, Omar Rodriguez, who is Ecuadorian from Quito, and he reflected on the personal impact that this work, listening to hundreds of stories of migrants and refugees, of Colombian refugees, had on him in re-examining his own prejudices that he had learned from growing up. So I actually want to have you listen to just a minute or so of him with that reflection.
También tenemos un programa de investigación en fronteras sobre la situación de los migrantes y refugiados colombianos especialmente. Esto a mí en lo personal me llegó muy profundamente, a pesar de que nosotros tal vez hemos crecido con no sé, convicción de que de pronto el colombiano es malo, el colombiano viene a hacer cosas perjudiciales para nuestro país, y es como algo muy común, y es como, bueno, todo el mundo cree que eso es lo correcto. Pero al contactar con ellos, al tener mirar su realidad, ver la manera como desempeñan su vida, cómo están con sus hijos, de pronto ya deja de ser el colombiano, sino de pronto entiendo que ese se llama Juan.
So even those of us who are trying to investigate and produce this knowledge are also being transformed by it. And that, again, is back to the point I made earlier of the power of being a scholar practitioner, that you can't see research and knowledge creation as separate from processes that are designed to try to change the world, or at least change ourselves.
Yeah, I was just kind of reflecting there that many fields enact change, of course, but I think it's so obvious in social science, once you really start to dig into it, that if you're interested in changing the world, you also have to begin by changing yourself with education, by creating new ways of understanding meaning. And in social science, we talk about meaning quite a lot. And earlier you were talking about the meaning that people make over hearing a different accent or seeing a different skin tone. Yes, these are all culturally bound, right? And so challenging those assumptions and those expectations are really, it's often identifying what is blocking us from thinking more fully about people and situations and the way that things could be. So I guess one thing that I'm really interested to find out from you is, so let's say that I'm a person who is unknowingly engaging in the invisibility bargain. So I've identified that. Well, then what? What do I do with that information?
Yeah. So part of this process requires us to make ourselves vulnerable, to recognize our own participation, our own positionality in structures that harm some people, and try to reposition ourselves so that that's not happening within the power that we have ourselves. And I think actually one of the things that gets underplayed is how much hierarchy and authority can be weaponized. So one of the reasons that I have such a commitment to this sort of reciprocal learning of not putting myself on a pedestal and saying, here, I'm the sage expert, receive my wisdom, is that the more hierarchies that you reproduce, the more you're shoring up a system that says only those on top have power and can influence outcomes. Those below must receive them and be affected by them. But again, not seen, not heard, but contribute your labor. And so the kind of precarity that the invisibility bargain reproduces is a lot about maintaining this hierarchy. And one of the real findings that came out of my book was not just to expose that this happens, that that there's a precarity that results from a system that extracts people's labor while demanding their political silence and social similarity. It also showed that migrants innovate. They're not content just to be placed as either a victim or a villain, both of which, by the way, deny you agency. Either you're the bad guy or the helpless person waiting to be saved. And lots of migrants say, well, no, I'm not either of those. I want to exercise agency over my own life. And so what I found is they find ways to participate politically, to get the rights, resources, recognition, and protection that they need to be secure. We talk about human security in this context, in informal and indirect ways. So rather than demanding, government, I have the right to this, you better give it to me, or voting for someone as a sort of full member of society demanding it, both of those would invoke the sort of backlash from the political invisibility thing. Instead of that, they network. They plug into organizations that may be non-state actors, a church that they go to, a community association. In Ecuador, there are Colombian organizations that are sort of the migrants themselves working to help each other out. Those are more trusted often because they don't have to be enforcers as well as sort of help providers. And so migrants may go to those places and say, here's some of the things I'm dealing with, and be more trusting and be willing to access those spaces. That organization may not have the resources or the help to offer, but they have relationships and they can refer people within that that space to someone who can help. And so I talk about this in terms of governance networks, that when state and non-state actors are well connected with each other, it can open up spaces that provide protection. And governance networks can actually be more powerful than just having a stronger state. There's a tendency to think, well, if the law isn't working, migrants aren't being protected, we need to increase state capacity to protect them better. But in some contexts, the state has political incentives to protect its own native citizens and not migrants, right? Who votes in a democratic state? Usually people who are born here. In Ecuador, at least, most Colombians haven't been there long enough to become citizens. And so the state has that incentive and may have an incentive to scapegoat migrants and actually make their life worse off. Whereas other kinds of non-state actors may have different mission, different incentives. And so again, this transformation from a hierarchy that produces and reproduces violence into a networked decentralized society, which is more messy, it's indirect, but it offers multiple access points for protection for migrants, and it provides spaces where they can be interacting in meaningful ways with members of the host society, reinforcing their relational capital, and that can be a powerful source of protection for them. And so I think all of us can, when we're trying to think, well, what can I do to help, is have a bit of humility and say, not, let me come parachute in with the solution and the answer. Instead, find ways to learn, to make relationships, to build networks, and offer those things to migrants in your own communities. And I think when we have a more sort of rich and well-connected civil society, that makes us more resilient. When an attack or a sort of xenophobic incident happens, it makes for a bigger community to rally in defense of all members of the community.
So if I can try to capture that, instead of being crushed, people will innovate, and they will maybe not resist. It's not resistance necessarily, but it is resilience. Yes. Yeah. And so, well, in terms of resilience versus resistance, I'm kind of hearing you say that migrants in this position, they're well aware of the pushback, the backlash that could come from any sort of resistance. So they're really maybe not even always consciously trying to figure out ways not to trigger that, correct?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is I like the framing of resistance and resilience is the go-to measure here. But I actually think that resistance is sometimes what they're doing. They're just doing it in less visible ways that are not overt and are not targeting the state as directly. So they're finding ways to do it indirectly through brokers in civil society, and through more informal negotiation.
So in some sense, it is also kind of co-creating governance for themselves when governance is not extended, yes?
Absolutely. And in Ecuador, that draws on a rich tradition that was baked into indigenous culture. In a lot of indigenous communities, they were abandoned by the state traditionally, and they developed a concept called the minga, which is a sort of community reciprocal workday to produce collective goods that the government wasn't going to provide for them. And so now refugees do that together as well. Instead of waiting for the government to help them or protect them, they develop these sort of horizontal structures of protection, as well as resources and other things.
So maybe this is a really obvious question, and I know that most of this research has been done in Latin America and in Ecuador specifically. But in terms of networked governance, do you see any kind of need for that in our context?
Absolutely. I actually think there's an argument of the strength of weak states. So there's an assumption that the more capacity a state has, the better they're going to provide security. And my research really questions that and challenges it. The United States and South Africa both have states that are stronger, that have more capacity than the Ecuadorian one on most indicators. And yet in both of those places, the violence and conflict that is enacted on immigrant populations is much higher than in Ecuador, which for much of the past 2 decades has actually been internationally known as a relatively progressive and welcoming country. And I think part of it is that when you put all your eggs in the basket of the state, you're assuming that that's the sort of one-stop shop for protection. But those political incentives, again, mean the state actually may not want to provide protection to immigrant populations and may want to scapegoat them. Whereas if you have non-state actors that have popped up and developed sources of authority because the state's not there or isn't assumed to be the only game in town, then you have different actors that can complement each other. Each of them have strengths and weaknesses. And the more that they are coordinated with each other, the easier it is to produce sort of protection and peace.
So it sounds like what you're calling for is we need a real ecosystems model. We can't just have an organism, because organisms don't exist in vacuums, as far as we know, right? I'm not a biologist, but we need lots of things that are supporting each other and feeding into processes and cycles for the overall health of everybody, or all the groups that are involved, to really work. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow, that is very complex. Let's see, what else can I ask you here? Well, we have less than 10 minutes left. So what I would love to ask you is, briefly, in your own words, what is your hope? What is your absolute ideal of an outcome if people were to really latch on to the idea of the invisibility bargain and networked governance?
So I think part of it is just to clarify some of the structures and processes that happen that produce the harm, right? We can't address what we don't understand. And so it's helping to clarify in a relatively simple framework some of these processes that are often unwritten, and we may not even be conscious. When we feel resentful, who are they to be coming in here and trying to tell us what to do? All those pronouns are saying something, right? Who is us and who are they? Why does us have ownership and they don't, if we all share the same space and are sort of, governed by the same set of institutions? And so part of what I'm hoping is that by exposing these structures and the unwritten expectations, we better understand why the reactions happen that do. On the networked governance piece and the role of personal interaction here, I'm hoping that people will realize that it's not only policy change at the top levels and elite driven institution building that can solve the problem, right? These are baked into cultures and societies. So those things are important. It is important to have institutions that work well and that are designed to promote integration and peaceful coexistence. But they have to be accompanied by culture change, by self-awareness and introspection. And in the kinds of policy targeting, designing programs and interventions to help resolve conflict, I think that being aware of this sort of networked component should lead us all to be more comfortable in sitting with complexity. Just because something is neat and tidy and lasts for a one-year project cycle and then has little indicators that you can check off doesn't mean that it's transformed a system. Whereas something that is maybe messy and involves lots of different actors, including some that you didn't know before, right? Existing community groups that have influence within their own networks, you need to partner with those groups, because as an outside organization coming in trying to fix the problem, you're reproducing the problem by sort of having that hierarchy. You need to come in partnering with the folks who everyone already listens to and see how you can work from the assets that are there and how you can learn from each other in order to build capacity of the whole community. So that strengthening governance networks in ways that don't only flow through the state or through big international NGOs, but that strengthen each of those aspects, I think is important. So we can all take recommendations, in a sense, from that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it does bring my mind back to a conversation our team had not too long ago with Tracy Kesey of the Center for Policing Equity, where she was talking about the co-production of public safety, which if the audience has not had the chance to see that recording is up on intentionallyact.com in a course called From Kneeling to Standing Together. But it seems like kind of what we're getting at is there are a lot of pinch points, especially in the US context. So police are expected to handle crime, mental health, a variety of tasks that they are not well trained for. And I'm also seeing that parallel with teaching, right? So we've got people who are expected not only to teach our young people, but to be all things to those people. So it seems like network governance could really help us out a lot in a lot of ways, especially by helping us to not reinforce these systems of oppression that are crushing all of us. Um,
Absolutely. I think that part of it is what keeps us safe. There's an assumption that has become dominant over the past 3.5 years, or maybe more, but especially during that time period, that what keeps us safe is putting up a wall and keeping the bad guys out, the others out. That way, us, the peaceful us, will be fine. And their presence is what makes us unsafe. And unfortunately, the remedies, when you think that, reproduce violence that is more intense than what you had before. Whereas connection, trusting each other, is what really helps safety to accomplish. The more you see the other person as a threat and as the source of your insecurity, the more likely it is you are to do unsafe things towards them, and it creates a violent cycle. Whereas if you see them as just like you, as someone who also wants to be safe, and bring them in, connect with them, then that's where peace comes from. That's where we find that no one wants to harm each other. They're all in this sort of relationship, and so I think that is important what you raised.
Yeah, and if we could just really drill down kind of deep on that relationship part. So in social science, we've got that problem of using words that are in common usage, but mean something very different in a social science context. So when we're talking about relationships, we're talking about not just somebody whose face I know on the street, right? It's somebody who I have real emotional investment with, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about a friendship, a working relationship, something like that. Yeah.
That is an important caveat, and I was avoiding going too deep into the numbers and everything from my research, but maybe it would be important to say that in my survey of Colombians in Ecuador, I asked them actually about their general perception towards Ecuadorians. Is it generally positive, generally negative, or no opinion? And I asked them, do you know any Ecuadorians? How often do you interact with each other, and in what kind of spaces? Is it on the street, in the marketplace, never at all, or like friends in the workplace, at school, that are more meaningful? And the difference is striking. Of the people who said that they had no interaction with Ecuadorians, 0 of them had a positive perception of Ecuadorians in general, whereas 70% had a negative perception. Of those who had meaningful interaction, more than half had a positive perception, and less than 20% had a negative perception. Those who had casual interaction, what you were talking about on the street, whatever they already believed was just baked in. So high on both positive and negative, and just no opinion was pretty low. So casual, superficial interaction isn't enough. It has to be meaningful, equal status interaction towards a shared purpose.
Well, thank you for clarifying all of that for us. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of what the invisibility bargain is. It's a concept that I hope our audience will take an interest in. And Jeff, could you plug your book real quick one more time?
Sure. Well, again, thank you so much for having me on, and to be able to help me think through some of these interactions between the immigration space and race. The book is called Negotiating Identity and Belonging Through the Invisibility Bargain, and that's coming out from Oxford University Press soon.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jeff, for being our first guest on this new format that we're so excited about. We will be engaging with the audience in the comments on our various platforms. We will also be hosting the recording somewhere, most likely on intentionallyact.com. So you can head there if you didn't catch it live. And we are working on bringing you more of these sessions live on a more regular basis. So do stay tuned to our pages so that we can get you that information. Thanks again, Jeff, and good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure, and have a good afternoon, everyone.